Welcome back to another episode of The Loco Fit Show, where we redefine what healthy means to you. I'm your host, Laurin, and today I'm interviewing Dr. Bill Campbell. You guys hear me talk about him all the time. He was my grad school advisor. He's a professor of exercise science at the University of South Florida and an all-around amazing person. So welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me back to the show. I love visiting you. This is exciting.
I know. Every time we go on the phone, it's literally like, okay, we're going to talk about the craziest stuff for an hour. And then we literally get off and we're like, we're going to talk for like 2 more hours, but we actually have things to do. So probably just shouldn't talk all day. But yes, you have been one of the most impactful people in my life. And I am so happy that the program is doing so great. So just give a little background for anybody who is a new listener on the program, what we do in the undergrad and grad program, and then we'll get into today's topic.
Okay, so I am a faculty member in the exercise science program at the University of South Florida. We have an undergrad program and a master's program, which you graduated from the master's program. I run a research lab in that program called the Performance and Physique Enhancement Laboratory. And that focuses on exactly what it sounds like, performance and physique. We mainly focus on losing body fat through diet, supplements, exercise programs. And we also look at some performance measures, but in particular, staying with the physique aspect, how to build muscle mass. So fat loss, building muscle, that's kind of the focus. That's the passion that I have and that you were helping to get off the ground when you were there a few years ago.
Yeah, it was honestly crazy to see how much the lab has grown and changed. And me and Dr. Campbell actually did an entire episode breaking down my study. That was a really good episode. So if you guys are interested, I will link that below. I do not remember the number of the episode. I am not that good, but I will link that below. So in case you guys have not heard it, we did the research on looking at how weight loss and weight regain are influenced by the type of diet. So flexible dieting, which was IFYM, as well as a meal plan. So we looked at all those different things during the fat loss period and after. So anyways, now there's a ton of great stuff that you guys have done since then. But today we wanted to actually focus on just research in general, reading research. And I think a lot of people are interested in research, but you go to Google Scholar, you go to PubMed and you're like, all right, now what? Or you download a paper and you're like, okay, now what? Like there's a lot of different things. So I wanted to first just break down, let's break down the structure of a paper. So there's going to be the abstract, the introduction, the methods, the results, and the discussion. So what is going to be in the abstract that people would be looking for? What is this a measure of, etc.?
Yes, and right before I touch on the abstract, I just want to say if you are a person that wants to read a research study, that's a admirable, just a desire, a furthering of your intellect, because that's only a few, and I would call them elite people, even go there, that you care enough to know what's current, what the science says. Unfortunately, most people in our space, they could care less what the science says. It's what influencer Ian says, or whatever's on Facebook. So I have
hopefully influencer Ian has read some studies, but he may or may not have.
I highly doubt it. So I have a ton of respect for people who they actually have the desire to want to know the science, because it is a lofty goal.
Yeah, and before we even touch on this, right? I'm like, backtrack one more time. We can't even start the bullet points that we. So, what is something that really distinguishes research from, let's say, like a book, right? So when you just said it, that's why it caught my attention. Research is obviously very current, right? Whereas if somebody writes a book or puts something together, that's going to be a culmination of studies, right? But sometimes people will look for, what's a good nutrition book to read? And I'm often like, I don't know. There's not often a lot of published books that are in the nutrition space. I feel like that do a really good job of capturing current stuff. I feel like most books, not all, because there are certainly books. And if you wanted to provide me a list of quality books, we could certainly add that to the show notes as well. But a lot of times books are like, cut out sugar forever. And, it's like Bozo Diet 101. Like that's what, if you go to like Barnes & Noble and you go to the diet section, you're going to see a bunch of crazy stuff. And a lot of times what happens is research is obviously very new, whereas the books sometimes use research, but sometimes they don't, right? So I feel like if you want to look at research, it's going to be a lot more specific. Mm-hmm. And sometimes maybe this isn't really a question. I was like, I'm asking a question. I'm kind of more so saying a statement, I guess.
Well, I have an answer to your non-question
too.
Okay,
what is the answer? to my fake question.
I think your question was the difference between a book and a research study.
Okay, yeah, we'll go with that.
A book is oftentimes written for the purpose to direct the reader back to the author's business or a product. So there's a lot more marketing in a book. In theory, a research study is devoid of all of that. It is, in theory...
Which, LOL, we'll get to that.
Yeah, we'll talk about some exceptions. But in theory, research is done for the pure pursuit of knowledge. You don't care how many people read it, per se. Now everybody wants you to read their research studies.
I'm like, please go read my name. I paid a lot of money for you to read it.
But yeah,
Not kidding.
A research study is just for the pursuit of knowledge. Again, some books are written for that as well.
Certainly.
But I do not read any book without appreciating what does the author really want? Are they really just giving information? And something I just learned recently in marketing, a lot of people will write books with no intention of selling any. They just want to be able to say author, and then people think, oh, well, this person's an author. So it is a thicker business card for a lot of people in all industries. Mm-hmm. So the fitness space being no different. So
I just feel like there's so many junk books with nutrition. Like I rarely, there's one really great book. I always reference it. It's called The Hungry Brain.
Yes.
That's an amazing book, right? One of my favorite references, to be honest. But almost exclusively all of the books that I read, and this is also just what I'm personally interested in, is more, psychology, personal development, leadership, business. Like I gravitate more towards those books. So when people ask me, do you have any nutrition book recommendations? I'm like, not really. At this point, right? It doesn't mean that there aren't any great ones. So yeah, if you have any that you want to add to that list, we can certainly put that in the show notes. Okay, so let's get to it. So abstract. So we're commending you. You've logged on to Google Scholar. You're doing great. Now what happens? You find a paper and the first thing you see is the abstract.
And the abstract is a summary of the entire study. It's very nice. Science is often not reader friendly. The abstract is reader friendly to the extent that it gives you a snapshot of the entire study in one paragraph, typically 400 to 500 words. Maximum is what the abstract is. So it will tell you the purpose of the study, the methods, like what they did, the results, and then an interpretation of those results. So it's the place that you should always start, just to give you kind of like looking at a map. It gives you the lay of the land.
Yeah, to see if you're even interested in reading the paper, right? There's so many times where I've clicked on a study where I'm like, oh, this will be really interesting. And then I see the abstract and I'm like, do I have all the time to dedicate to read to this? Probably not. Like this, the title looked great, maybe not what I want to read. And then vice versa. Sometimes the title is kind of and then you see the abstract, you're like, actually, this is super interesting. Let me dive in further. So yeah, abstract is going to be kind of like the Cliff Notes. Maybe it was a good way of putting it, right?
I like that.
Cliff Notes version, like you said, less than 500 words. And then we're going to get to the introduction. So the introduction is very different. It's going to be kind of a summary of a lot of different research. That'd be a good way of putting it, right?
Yeah, I would say it's the background for why they performed the study. Why did we do this study? What else do we know about this topic? So you're bringing all of that into, so it just gives context to the study. So as an example, in your flexible dieting study, the introduction part of it was, this has never been looked at before in resistance-trained individuals. We don't know if flexible dieting is better or worse in this population. We had real-life thoughts, but never under the rigor of a scientific study. So there's an example in real life.
Yeah, so for our introduction, basically, I looked at it and I said, all right, let's take all of the research that we do know, right? We know, okay, here's some of the weight regain literature that we know. Here are some of the eating behavior literature that we know. And here's what we do know about resistance-trained high-protein diets. Okay, that's like, here's a conglomerate of things. And then this is what we created. And oftentimes the introduction is actually one of my favorite parts, especially if I'm reading something to then, write something about it and I can find more citations. That's usually one of my favorite places to find other citations is if this paper is interesting, well, then I can go to their introduction. I can see a few things that they've referenced. Then I can go to those papers, right? So that's like a really good way if you're looking for more resources. That's a great place to look. And like you said, get a background and an understanding understanding of why they're doing the study. What else do we know, right? Because sometimes it's about, hey, we know this, but there was a really big gap, right? Like, so say, okay, we know high protein diets work, but we know that really low maybe isn't great, but like really high, like what is the limit, right? Like we know that higher is better, but like what does higher mean? Like how high do we need to go? And I know you guys did that one protein study where it was looking at, I'm blanking on the amounts, but there was a lower and then a higher protein.
Yes, yep, 2.5 for the high grams per kg.
And that was a low?
0.9 grams per kg.
So that was a pretty distinguishable difference, but it wasn't like it was, nothing to like super, super high, right? Because I think, Dr. Antonio was on like 4.4?
4.4.
Yeah, 4.4. Like that number's like burned into my mind. Like, oh my God, could you imagine? It would be a horrible diet. In any case, so introduction is going to be showing kind of what you know, presenting the question. We know this. This is why we're asking this follow-up question, or we don't know this. And here's the background information that we're using for that. So I would definitely encourage people to read the introduction just so you have a better idea, especially if you're not really too sure about what this topic is. And then we're going to get to the methods. So what is in the methods?
The methods is all of the details. So
the boring stuff.
Yes. If you're a mechanic, it is looking under the hood of the guts, the engine of the study. So what did they do? How did they do it? How many subjects? Who were the subjects? So it is very specific, and it's I think you said it's definitely the most boring, most technical details.
But it's super important.
Yeah, it will give you, if you know how to read a method section, you'll be able to look for holes in the study, shortcomings, limitations, or even in some cases the bias. And hopefully there is limited bias, but if there is any bias in the research, the methods should be able to highlight that.
Yeah, because you're going to be able to see, are these people normal weight, overweight, obese, age range? You're going to see all the demographics. You're going to see the average body fat starting. You're going to see, okay, hey, we're measuring body fat. Well, what did you do? Did you use a handheld BIA? Did you use a DEXA? Did you use calipers? Did you, you're going to be able to see all these different things. Is this an animal study? Is this a human study? Like these are really important questions. So while I'm joking and saying it is boring and it is technical, if you're really looking to get a better idea, and there's certainly some methods that are going to be better than others, right? Which is why it's important. Were these people free living? Were they in a, metabolic ward? Were they given the food supervised for a training program? Or were they simply given a training program? We hope that they completed it and they could have lied, but we're not really sure, but we're going to, right? Like there's all these different things that you're going to find out in the method. So saying somebody was on a training program is very different than saying that they were instructed to do this training program or they were supervised, like in your studies, supervised during the workouts. Very, very different. And those are small details, but that actually makes it, a large difference in terms of the results, which is next. So you're going to look at the methods. You're going to learn every single thing about how they ran this study. And again, some of it is really technical, not necessary unless you're a scientist, right? Like sometimes the way, the depth that it's described is like, all right, is this really relevant for what I need to be doing or my understanding? For the average person, probably not, but obviously it has to be in there. And then the results. So this is going to be a written kind of feedback as well as a lot of the graphs and figures is going to be in this part.
Yeah, so results, think of tables and figures. It's usually where you're going to see most of them. And it's simply the methods. The introduction tells us what they were going to study. The methods tell us how they studied it. Now the results are exactly what it sounds like, what they found. Did this diet perform better than the other diet? Did this dietary supplement cause more fat loss than a placebo? So the results are kind of the most important part of the paper once you have an understanding of the methods.
And I would also say, though, that this is super technical. And unless you're good with statistics, there's going to be a lot of those words. It's going to be a lot of, it can get pretty confusing. And some people, I feel like, don't put the effort in to make it easier to read. Like some papers you read, you're like, okay, I got this. Like maybe this isn't like totally in my wheelhouse, but like I can understand it. And then some papers I'm like, I feel like you guys are just trying to make this harder for us to understand. You know what I mean? And certainly some topics are going to be more specific and nuanced than others, especially when we're talking about like animal models. The stuff that they can do with animal models is completely different than they can do with humans. Obviously, we're going to talk about the IRB and different things like that. So there's certain things that you can do in animal studies or in animal models that are going to be so much more technical. So if you're ever reading papers like that, it can be very overwhelming because you're like, I don't even understand half of what they're talking about here. Whereas if we're talking about like a fat loss study, like, okay, pretty straightforward, fat mass, fat-free mass, body weight, body fat percentage, like I got all those things. We're talking about, different gene expressions and this and that, like that can get really, really hard to read about. Still important if it's a topic of interest to you, but it's going to be a lot harder. So what would be, we often hear statistical significance, and that is what is going to represent that there was, we saw a statistically significant difference here. What does that mean?
That means that the results were not due to chance. So as an example, if we have 10 people and we give them a supplement, let's just say caffeine, and we measure their vertical jump, just by chance, 1 out of 10 people is going to jump higher. It has nothing to do with the caffeine. It's just by chance. They feel they slept better that night, or they just have more energy. They just broke up with their girlfriend and now they're really, they got rid of a bad relationship and then they're just jumping higher. They got more energy just by chance. So when you see these p-values and statistically significant statements, that is accounting for that and saying, this was not due to any random error or chance. This was because of the intervention. And then the example I just gave, it was because of the caffeine that we gave. So that's a very high bar in science. We actually take a 95% certainty that it would not due to chance.
So when you see p less than 0.05, that's what that means. And if you see p less than 0.01, that means that with 99% confidence, we can say that this was because of the intervention. Now, that still does not mean that there's not a very wide range, which is why oftentimes looking at the tables and the graphs is really important. And again, some scientists make this easier to read than others, right? Like some graphs and tables are clearly superior, but you can see like, all right, the average, because science is working on averages, on average, we saw this amount of change. And we can say with confidence, this was because of the intervention. But that still is not talking about the outliers and the extremes, right? So while the average might have been a 3-pound fat loss, somebody could have lost half a pound and somebody could have lost 10 pounds and we still could have came to that same result. So oftentimes looking at the results section and looking specifically at the tables and the graphs, you can see that spread. And that's often really useful information to really tease out kind of those details and to really understand the results a little bit better. And then lastly, you're going to see the discussion, which this is going to be where the author is sharing their thoughts on the result. So this is probably the most opinionated section. Now, obviously, the introduction is also the opinion and the synopsis of the current literature and why they're doing this, whereas the methods and the results are pretty straightforward, or they should be, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, should be.
But the discussion is very open for interpretation, correct?
Yeah, and as you said, it's the author's interpretation of their results. So oftentimes they'll talk about this in light of the other studies in the introduction. The introduction says this is what we know. Now that we have our knowledge from our data, this is where this fits into the other studies that we know the outcomes of. So the discussion is exactly that. And it also will say, let's say they didn't find an effect that they thought. So a particular diet didn't cause fat loss. The discussion is where they would say, well, here are some reasons why we didn't observe fat loss when we thought we would have. And it could be whatever reasons. And then here's where methods. What if the study length was 3 days? You're probably not going to lose fat in 3 days, and that's where your knowledge of the methods will become important. The other thing is, in the discussion, let's say they lost 5% body fat in 6 weeks, so it was extremely effective. The discussion will help us. Well, here's why this diet was, or theoretically, or what we think made this diet more effective was because of X, Y, or Z. So it's interpreting the results within the context of what we know, and also explaining why or why not we found these results in our best or our educated opinion.
And then also future research considerations a lot of times are included in there. Hey, we saw this or we didn't see this. Future research should be aimed towards this. And then that helps other scientists, kind of guide their direction as far as what are the questions to ask. And then lastly, there's going to be all the citations. And of course, that's a great place. Like I said, you can find, if you're interested in the paper that they're using, especially in the introduction, you can see, this is, this other paper looked at this, and then you can find more citations from there, which is one of my favorite things to do if I'm researching and writing something. one thing we always hear about is like, don't be like an armchair scientist, right? Don't just be like an abstract reader, one of those things. And so why would we potentially encourage somebody not just to look at the abstract, right? Like, it's very tempting because, like I said, it's a Cliff Notes version. It's 500 words. It's a lot easier to digest than reading the whole paper. Why would you maybe encourage somebody to not just look at the abstract?
Probably the biggest problem with just the abstract, that is not, it's only looking at a snapshot. And not that abstracts are overtly biased, but the abstract may tell a different story than the actual results. And also if you have a knowledge of the methods, because you're only getting a sentence or two of how the study was done in the abstract, but there's going to be a whole section in the paper about how the study was done. So if you can go into and get some of these important details, you will be able to interpret the abstract better than how it's often presented. So I don't like to admit this, but I believe some abstracts are worded in such a way to kind of like a hook in marketing, where you're trying to get the reader's attention. And then the study, didn't really show this. I'll give an example. A study may have looked at 10 different variables of strength and muscle gain. So muscle fiber, type 1, type 2, type 2X, muscle fiber area, DEXA, lean body mass, and maximal squat strength, leg press strength. So a bunch of variables for strength and muscle hypertrophy. Let's just say 10 different measures. They found one significant difference in type 2A muscle fiber area in the hamstrings. If that's what they choose to only put in the abstract, you think, oh, wow, this workout that they did really increased hamstring hypertrophy. And then you realize when you actually go into the paper, the other 9 things they found nothing. That leads me to think that hamstring finding was probably due to chance, even though we have there's still a 5% chance with our P less than 0.05 value. So there's why just reading the abstract doesn't give you the full picture. You're making an uninformed opinion on the study if that's all you read.
It's basically like reading just the headline, right? Like
Yes.
on a news article or something online, right? You see the article and again, clickbaity, and you're like, oh my gosh, or you see the title of a YouTube video, something like that. And people think, oh, science wouldn't do that. Scientists are people, and they understand they want their papers to be downloaded. They want the notoriety and the funding because better results gets better funding. And anybody who thinks that stuff doesn't exist, like this is 100% how this works. So they are going to showcase, of course, put their best foot forward, right? Like, why wouldn't you?
Yes.
But you can't just look at that and then go, oh, I made my opinion based off of the abstract that I saw.
And I just want to say, in defense of scientists, the potential for them doing that is there. I still believe that not. You can look at an abstract and feel good, but you just have to recognize sometimes you're going to come across a study where the abstract did not really summarize the entire picture, whether that was by accident or on purpose.
If you're sharing something, hey, I saw this study, I read this abstract, need to look more into it, right? I wouldn't just blatantly be like, read this abstract, I know everything about this paper. Like, don't then share that information in that way, right? Would maybe be our takeaway from that. Mm-hmm. Let's touch really quickly on the peer review process, because when you write this paper, you can't just write whatever you want and then it gets submitted. So when it gets uploaded, there is a peer review process, and there are going to be journals that have a more stringent peer review than others. So let's just talk briefly about that process and kind of what that looks like.
So a peer review process is where you submit your paper and you hope that it gets accepted by the journal that you want to publish in. In order for that to happen, they're going to invite other experts to review your paper, and they are going to try to find mistakes. They're going to try to find where you should be more clear. They're going to ask, why did you choose this particular approach to answering the question rather than this one? So it's a very reflective process, and it can come across like you're just called me, ugly and stupid. Even though that's not the intent. They are trying to tell me I'm not ugly and stupid, but they want me to just defend.
They might say that.
Well, I choose to think now that they're just critiquing my work.
Like after many nights crying myself to sleep.
So yes, they are making you improve on how you're phrasing things, defending your particular methods. And here's a big one that you often can see in a not well peer-reviewed paper. In your discussion, you're talking about things that you didn't even study. So that's one thing peer review does a good job of. Hey, you're talking about this, but you didn't even measure this. Delete that. Stick to what you studied, because that's the knowledge that you gained, not on what interests you. So that's another important thing. So peer review is a good thing, even though as a person who submits papers, it's very tedious, extra work. But ideally, it improves the product. So the other thing is, if a paper is published in a good journal, you can feel good that it's been vetted by the best people, or hopefully some of the other experts in that space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a very important part of the process. It is tedious, kind of like, honestly, research is just tedious. If you can take one word away from research, it's tedious. But it is very rewarding and, can contribute to obviously a lot of other really great discoveries, which is why we continue to do it. So when you first get started, there's something called the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. So kind of like you can't just publish any paper without a peer review, you also can't just do any study anymore, right? And the IRB came after World War II, after the Nuremberg trials, and when there was a lot of really awful things happening in the concentration camps under the name of science, and not just in Nazi Germany, also in Japan and all these different places. There was
and even in our own
I was like,
country.
a lot of places. But
let's just say it's been more than one example.
It's been more than one example, but that is. Wasn't I correct that it came after the Nuremberg trials in particular? I think when the IRB was created. That's what I thought. That's what I thought I learned in my little IRB lesson, but that was many years ago. So kind of skimmed through that one. But it was like, I got to watch all these videos too, Campbell. Like, what is this? But no, I mean, there's obviously been horrible things that have happened in the name of science. If anybody really wants an awful view of humanity, Unit 731, like this place in Campbell is yelling at me for putting my I was like, don't put your elbow on the table. And I
got a big lecture before we started about what I can't do with my hands, and now look at who's tapping the table.
No, so Unit 731 was this awful just concentration camp. I don't even know if it's called a concentration camp. It's a camp of sorts that was in Japan, or it was run by the Japanese, and it was in northern China. Anyways, if you guys want to just hear about the awful aspects of humanity, Jocko did a whole podcast on it, and he read parts of this. It was just literally horrifying to be like, people actually have done this. And then when they found out that they lost, they basically burned the whole place and got the F out of there. And then basically the US and Russia had to fight over who was going to get the information. And just crazy stuff that's happened in the name of science. So we have IRBs. The whole reason I'm going on this tangent, we have IRBs so that we, can't just do these types of things, to humans and animals, right? The animals have, I know nothing about the animal IRB board, I'll be honest. But I do know that there are very particular things, and you can't just do whatever you want to animals either. So what is, a little bit about that process? So what are some things that we basically can't do? Can't starve people anymore. The Hansel Keys studies, can't redo those.
So you said IRB stands for Institutional Review Board, as you said, and basically that is, and this is before you even start the study. This is getting approval to do the study. And it's like a 20, sometimes 30-page document just to get permission to do what you want to do.
And then you get rejected twice.
You could get that only happens to I'm just joking.
It
can happen to you. What they're doing with the IRB is just making sure that subjects won't be harmed. That is the primary effort here. So are you going to include pregnant women? Have you thought about these 9 things? Are you using prisoners? Well, then have you thought about this? The other thing related to an IRB is informed consent, and that is where you have to tell the subject, as you recruit them, this is exactly what we're going to do. Here's the risks that you're going to have if you do this study. So like in our case, we do a lot of dieting studies. One of the risks is hunger. One of the risks is maybe feeling irritable. So things like that, again, that's pretty benign, but that's what the IRB makes you spell out. It makes you say, what are the risks? What are the benefits? You can also tell them what the benefits are. So the IRB and the informed consent are all about protecting the subjects. They have to be fully aware of what they're going to have to do in the study and what tests you're doing and what you're going to do with their data. Are you going to sell it to a third party? No, of course we don't do that. And then there's one caveat. I don't do this research, but there are some deception studies where you'd say, hey, this popcorn's low fat. Then you want to see, do they eat more of it? So there are some...
all the psych studies.
Yeah, so when I say you have to tell them, there is a place where you can deceive subjects. But
within reason.
Within reason, exactly. That's exactly right. That's well played.
So, okay, you do the IRB. You hopefully get approval unless you get denied like I did, and then you have to redo it. Now, what about funding? So that's an important topic to discuss. You might need, so there could be two instances, right? There could be an instance where you're looking to get funding so you can do something for the study, right? Like, hey, we want to have blood work done. So we're going to need funding for this study because our lab doesn't do this in particular. And that's something that, you guys don't do on site. So if you want to get blood work done, that's going to be extra funding. Hey, we need a new piece of equipment for this, to run the study. This is the funding. Or are there other types of funding as well, just kind of like general funding from like a company? And sometimes that happens, I would say, probably outside of, so there's research that's done at universities, and then there's research that's done at just research institutions or just privately funded research, correct?
Yes, yeah.
They're all a little different.
Yeah, Clinical Research Center, CRCs, Mm-hmm. Yes. So yeah, funding is a very big thing to be aware of when you critique a study. So as an example, there's generally two sources of funding: the federal government and the private sector. Federal funding for studies are almost always going to look at health benefits. So looking at helping with Alzheimer's outcomes, obesity rates. There's usually going to be just, again, some public good
health initiative.
Yes. Private sector funding may have health outcomes, but it may be just to validate a dietary supplement. Does this supplement cause people to lift heavier weights? Is it ergogenic?
Yeah,
or
the
is
NIH
it not?
isn't going to fund that.
No, yeah, the federal government doesn't really care if you can bench press an extra 8%. But,
understandably.
But in our space,
how much you bench, bro?
In our space, that matters. So that's where you have to be aware. Is there bias? Mm-hmm. There's this word again. If somebody's funding the researcher, are they going to design a study in a certain way? And again, I think the assumption is no, the researcher are ethical. They're going to design the study as a true scientist would. That doesn't mean you should be naive and think, oh, there's no bias here. Everybody has some bias. And funding can tend to muddy those waters a little bit. So,
isn't there something with funding too, to where, like if somebody funds your research and then it isn't a positive outcome, you don't have to publish the study? Is that something that people can talk about up front?
Yeah, so that's a situation where who owns the data? Now, you're never going to read that in a study. That's all behind the scenes.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So basically, you could do, we talked about a product for bench press, right? Like the company could fund this, and then, you do the study, and then it shows there's no result. Then if you have signed something in particular, right, and I don't know what the name for all this is, but if you sign something, then the company could say, okay, we're not putting this out for peer review. We're not going to publish this.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Yeah,
and typically, if it's a university study, the university owns the data. If the research study is done in a non-university setting, oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes the company owns the data. So if the study does not come out favorable to the sponsor, the company in this case, then that study will never reach publication because it will never be submitted. So a higher standard is a university-conducted study. And just as an example, you work, like in my lab, I have students who actually need the publications to apply to grad school, or this is to put on their resumes. So yeah, I tell my team, we're only going to publish this if it works. Well, now I've just biased everybody because, of course, they want to get published. That would be a horrible motivation to do the study. So we operate in the sense, regardless of the outcome, we are going to publish this. Now, we can't control if it gets published, but we have the intention that we're going to submit it for publication.
And to be fair, I mean, even with our research, we didn't really find a lot of statistical significance outside of one variable, but that was still important, right? Like finding no differences was also an important finding.
Yes.
So it doesn't necessarily, now obviously it's a little bit different if there's like a specific intervention, like with a product, right? Like, or, that's a little bit different. But for us, I was like, okay, well, there's no differences. This is actually an exciting finding, to be fair. Like, it's maybe not the most exciting thing to read, but from a practitioner perspective or somebody who's reading it and synthesizing information for their own personal use or for, their clients or whatever, like, this is actually exciting to know that there are no differences here. So sometimes it's not necessarily a bad thing, but again, if that is how the funding was set up and all of that, and it's really important to recognize that, again, science is set up to be non-biased because of all these different layers, but things do slip through the cracks. And sometimes I feel like it's almost like people are just doing studies to not even be, what's the right word? Like, they're not even being creative. They're just trying to push out another paper so that they can say, oh, our lab pushed this out. And, we put out this many publications a year. And it's like,
nobody cares about what you studied.
Cares because you're not even pushing the envelope. You're not thinking about something in a creative and a new, innovative way. The whole point of science is to be innovative. But I often find that this, like the funding and all of that actually hinders everybody because then they don't feel like they can go outside the box and actually innovate because then we can't publish this or this won't be a good result. And then we'll just kind of stay in our little lane. And then you do that for so many years. And then you look up and you're like, oh my gosh, I haven't really I've contributed papers, but have I really contributed any innovation? Yeah.
Have I pushed the envelope to further or progress the field?
Yeah. And that's what the whole point of science should be, is innovation. So the other thing too, is to consider when you're reading research, something might be done or not be done, not because the researcher didn't want to do it, but because of the access that they had. So I just mentioned blood work, right? If we're talking about dieting, building muscle, really anything in the physique or performance category, like getting blood work would be pretty rad for any study. You know what I mean? Like there's not really a study where I'd be like, I don't think we need to include this. Like, it would just be useful information. But given the circumstances with funding, location, staff members, the reason you don't see it is not because we didn't want to measure it. It's because we didn't have access to it, right? And I think it's really important for people when they're reading stuff because everybody's like, well, why didn't you do this? Like, again, like the whole armchair scientist thing, like, well, if I did this study, I would have. Well, really? You would have done that? Because we had two people who were running the whole thing. It was a this many week study. We had this access. We only had this amount of money to work with. Like,
yeah, we only had this equipment.
Yeah, like, it's pie in the sky. Like, if I had access to every single thing, would I do this? Okay, maybe. But also then take into consideration, you're a participant, not just a reader now. You're a participant. Why do we not see certain studies? Because no one's going to fucking do that. Like, my favorite is all the bodybuilders and all the coaches and all the physique-minded people. Like, well, why isn't there a study? Okay, if you're prepping for a bodybuilding show, I'm somebody who has a large interest in science. I have published research. I've been in this for a long time. Over my dead body is any scientist running a study on me in a group, right? We'll do a case study all day long. That's why if you see physique athlete case studies, because that person is still just doing their diet and they're able to follow along. But I'm not going to say, hey, there's 25 of us in this group. Here's your target numbers. Go prep for this show.
And here's your workout.
Yeah, here's
your 3-day per week workout.
And the thing with research is you can't tailor it to the individual person because that is biased, right? If you're trying to study an intervention, there's 2 groups or there's 3 groups or whatever, there's a certain amount of groups and you have to fit into that group and you have to do the same thing as everybody else. So the reason we don't see certain studies done is not only because of lack of funding and access and, how many people are working there, but also just the design is not going to be feasible for a lot of people and a lot of individuals, especially specific populations, right?
Especially bodybuilders. They're just...
It doesn't make any sense. And anybody who has done a competition or is interested in a competition would not want to give that up. And rightfully so, like I'm very bought into this process, and I would not let anybody do that if I was prepping for a competition. It's just not something that's feasible. So when you're reading, take into consideration a few things, take into consideration, what probably the team had access to, and also put yourself in the shoes of the participant, right? Like there's a lot of times, even like our diet, which is one of the main reasons I believe that it got rejected by the ARB, was that we were taking normal weight people and dieting them to what they thought was a pretty aggressive diet. Now, they put overweight and obese people on 600 calorie diets. Like if you see like very low calorie diets, those are about 600-800 calories. But nobody blinks an eye at that because that population most likely needs to lose weight for health reasons. So the risks, the benefits outweigh the risks. But when they first saw ours and they said, oh my gosh, like 25% reduction of calories for a normal weight person, this is too much. I'm looking over here going, we needed to drop this even more, but that wouldn't have even gotten approved, right?
Yes.
So we would have seen even better results most likely. But again, in the context of what we have access to and also getting approved for this study, we're not able to do that. I can't say, hey, everybody, I really want to see the effects of a meal plan, eat tilapia and asparagus for, 10 weeks and come back to me. Not only is that not going to get approved, nobody is coming back and is following that plan, right? So like we had a meal plan, but it was a meal plan with options, right? It wasn't, so again, you have to take into consideration the actually being a participant in the study as well.
Yeah, what would you be willing to do?
What would you be willing to do? So when the researchers are writing that, it's also, that's partly what we're talking about as well. So when somebody has decided, okay, like I'm going to sit down and I'm going to read research, first, what would be, there's all different types of research papers, right? So let's go into that a little bit, like meta-analysis or a narrative review or a randomized control trial. Let's just break that down really quickly because I know there's a lot of words that people will see typically and they'll be like, wait, what's better, worse? Is there a difference? So let's start with the meta-analysis.
So a meta-analysis is a summary of all of the RCTs, which we'll talk about that in a moment. It's basically a summary of studies. It's a study of studies that pulls, let's say there's 10 studies on high protein diets and muscle gain. Let's just say there's 10 of them. A meta-analysis will take all 10 of them, perform a statistical technique, and quantify an overall finding of that body of literature. Not just one study, but all 10. So that's called a meta-analysis. The next one is the RCT, or what I like to call intervention study. This is where one group got one treatment, high protein, another group got another treatment, low protein. And that's the intervention. That was a randomized controlled trial, and then you just watch them for 6, 8, 10 weeks, and just talking about the kind of research that we do. And you see what the results were. That is the best kind of study, in my opinion. It's where you have one group of subjects getting one intervention, one group getting another intervention. Then the third type is narrative reviews. And these are, for lack of a better word, opinion papers. This is my opinion on high versus low protein diets for muscle gain. So as an example, instead of taking those 10 studies and performing a mathematical operation on them to come up with a statistic, I'm just going to talk about what I think. Yeah, these 5 studies showed this, these other 5 studies showed that, and in my opinion, this is what this means. Now, there's really good narrative reviews. I've published multiple narrative reviews myself. They are more prone to bias, so you have to be aware of that. Meta-analyses tend to have less bias because the data has to kind of speak for itself. And then the randomized controlled trial, again, those are the studies that are the best because you don't have any meta-analyses without these randomized controlled studies. So in your case, our study on flexible dieting versus a meal plan diet, that was a randomized controlled trial. One group got a diet meal plan, one group got a flexible dieting plan, and we just watched them for 20 weeks.
Mm-hmm. And then some, what's the word I'm looking for? Some bodies, right? Some like governing bodies will have position stands. So the ISSN has several position stands that multiple people will contribute. So like there's one on creatine, right? Or there's one on caffeine. So it's like, hey, here's a handful of scientists' opinions, maybe like 5-10 scientists right on there. The position stand on certain supplements, or there's other ones too, right? I'm like drawing
for the ISSN.
Yeah.
So there's we just published one on tactical athlete nutrition. We
Exactly.
have body composition.
So kind of general positions on certain topics or products, etc. So that is kind of more of a conglomerate of things, and not necessarily like any of those other boxes. It'd be more kind of like narrative review-ish.
Yeah,
maybe?
very narrative review-ish. In the health, like public health, they have what they call policy papers. In our field, we call them position stands.
Okay.
So I'm glad you mentioned this. It's an organization's interpretation of this broad area of research and saying, given all of these studies, we suggest X, Y, and Z. So if you are a firefighter, police officer, then this tactical nutrition strategies are the most evidence-based. So there's an example. So it's not an intervention. It's just looking at all of this, but then giving points of action, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And there's, again, all the references are in there. So it's not like this is just, written by pure opinion. This is backed by other research in the area. So definitely some good ones, especially on the JISSN. They have a lot of really, really great ones. I'm sure NSCA has some as well.
Yep.
And ACSM and all the big governing body organizations. So if you are, so now, okay, you sit down, you get on Google Scholar, you figure out, okay, I'm going to read this paper, or I'm interested in reading a paper. What would be something that you would say for the listeners? Like, all right, what would be a few key reasons to click on a certain paper outside of the title, right? Like after you go to the title and the abstract, like what are some things to then pinpoint and see, what should I look at this paper? Should I dive deeper into it? Because there's thousands of papers, you know what I mean? And you want to make sure that you're spending the time reading something that is of interest to you. So what would be a few metrics to look at?
The first thing I would say is just, what are you interested in? I'll talk for my own self. I'm interested in two things: fat loss and building muscle. Blood pressure, I could care less about. It's very important. There's a lot of research on it, and it's just, if a study if their primary focus is high blood pressure, I'm just going to gloss over that. But if there was a fat loss diet, wow. So does the study even address this? Mm-hmm. Once you've identified through the abstract, here's the value of the abstract. Oh yeah, look, they measured body fat. Then it's just, you would ask yourself, well, what did they do to lose body fat? What was the intervention? So now you know that. You know the study's relevant to your interest. Second, what was the intervention? What did they do to cause fat loss? What were the results? Did it work? Did it not work? Whatever intervention they did. And then lastly, what was the authors, this is where you get this in the discussion, what was their interpretation of their finding?
Yeah, so I think if you guys are interested in reading research, that is where you need to start. Figure out, okay, where there's just so much research. The reason I bring that up is because there is so much research. It's very, very overwhelming. And I think that a lot of people will see that and be like, well, I'm not really sure. So figure out one or two things that you really want to dive into. Of course, you can expand those interests over time. And that's usually, again, where those other citations embedded in there can really, really help you. But figure out, okay, I want to look at these one or two things. If it's in there, what do they measure? Is this of interest to me? And then you can start to read. And then there's really great things called research reviews. So what is awesome about this is because, again, there's thousands of papers published. I don't know the number, but I'm sure there's thousands of papers published every month, and
probably every week, thousands.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So thousands every week. So how are you going to sift through that, right? And there are a lot of really great research reviews that are out there. And what these aim to do is to take complicated topics or complicated papers. Like we said, these can be very, very technical. And unless you're really up to date with statistics and all that, even me now, I'm I read that and I'm all right, well, I hope they did a good job. Because for me, it's discerning all the statistics there can be very, very challenging. And it's not really my strong suit at this point. So something like a research review can be really great because scientists will typically take these larger concepts, break them down into something that's applicable. Every research review is going to be a little bit different. Again, it's going to have a different focus. What is the focus of this research review? Is this relevant to me? Are they focusing on training performance? Are they focusing on coaching methods? Are they focusing on performance? Are they focusing on health? Are they focusing on physique?
Yes.
Shameless plug.
If only there was one that only focused on...
Only. I love how we open it up with like, we're like, well, books are really biased and they sell stuff. And now we're like, here's...
I make no apologies. I am selling you education. If you want to be educated...
There is no apology. And that, I mean, I have no problem. The book comment was not because somebody has something to sell. We all have something to sell, whether it's knowledge or a product or a service or something. Like, that's how the world works is that's how businesses operate. So it's not, I'm not saying that it's a negative thing. And my point about the book comment was not to be disparaging. But it was, it's just, I wanted to tease out the differences between research that's thousands of papers are being published every week versus books are kind of a conglomerate. But yeah, selling education is incredibly important because all of your years of education, along with the years of education from the experts that you're bringing on to review this research and give their opinion, is unmatched. And that's not something that, people can just distill overnight. So explain the research review a little bit, explain what is interest and just how it's broken down. Because I think it's a really, really awesome concept how you guys did that.
Okay, so first thing, go to my website. It's very easy.
So simple, guys.
BillCampbellPhD.com. BillCampbellPhD.com. You will see my new research review. It's called Body by Science. And what that does is all of the effort that we've told you need to do to kind of read a study, interpret it. I do all that for you. I do all of the hard, boring things. And I do this in the categories of fat loss and muscle gain. So I summarize 2 studies per month that are solely focused on fat loss and muscle gain. And not only do I break down the science, I bring in experts in the field, and these are elite physique coaches, registered dietitians, physicians, sometimes other scientists, and what they do, and I think this is the true value of the Body by Science research review. So you're going to get the summary of the study, but the true value is how do other experts apply that research? Because if you just look at research and you think, I'm just going to, let's say you're a coach, I'm going to mimic this design to my clients. Well, that's a horrible way to interpret research. Get the expert's application. So right now I'm offering the first issue for free, and I brought in Laurin as my expert.
And that girl sounds stupid.
And I said this multiple times. You're the best coach that I know. So for the first issue. And again, this one's free. So this can give you a taste. Do you even like this? Does it help you professionally? And again, you don't have to be a coach. If you're just serious about your own training and nutrition, get this. And again, the first one's free. BillCampbellPhD.com. Top of the website, just download it. And I can't say enough. You get not only the breakdown of the research, but ideas of how to apply it. So, and I might have an idea of how to apply it, but then I see what you say, and I'm like, wow, I never thought of that. And again, you have, 10 years of experience in coaching? Well, of course you're going to have outstanding ideas about how to apply this research. So that's what it's called, Body by Science, 2 studies a month.
And I think that's a great breakdown because it's a really unique concept, but it's also not overwhelming, and I think that a big thing now is that there's so much information out there, right? Which is great, but it can also be really overwhelming. Just like there's a lot of studies, there's also just a lot of information, a lot of interpretation. So if you're going to throw at somebody all these different studies, that's like a big chunk of time to spend. So it's like, okay, 2 a month, that's very digestible for anybody, no matter how busy you are. So I'm incredibly excited for this. This has been in the works for quite some time. So I'm happy that it is finally out. I will be sure to put that in the show notes for you guys so you don't have to mess up the website like we did. I will also put in Dr. Campbell's Instagram handle. He puts out a lot of really great information on there as well. There's a ton of free education for you guys, again, in those topics of building muscle and losing body fat. So hopefully, and how to not lose muscle mass. So if you guys enjoyed the show, please share it. That is the best way to support us. For more information on one-on-one coaching, visit teamlocofit.com and be sure to sign up for our newsletter where you'll get great information and also be the first to hear about the app that we're releasing in the next few months. So thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.